In October 1942, a German major named Klaus von Hoffmann stood in a trench outside Stalingrad, looking through his binoculars at Soviet positions 300 yards away. He'd been an officer for 12 years, came from minor Prussian nobility, spoke 4 languages, considered himself part of the civilized military tradition. He turned to his adjutant and said something about Russian weapons, about how Soviet soldiers were equipped with rifles from the last century, about how Russian marksmanship was abysmal, about how the Eastern Front was a war between German precision and Slavic chaos. He was still talking when his head exploded. 1 shot, from somewhere in the rubble, from a Soviet sniper with one of those supposedly primitive rifles. 300 yards, perfect headshot. The major died without ever knowing what killed him. His adjutant dove for cover, terrified. That afternoon, 3 more German officers in the same sector were killed the same way. Headshots, from invisible shooters. By the end of the week, 17 officers in that division were dead. Not from artillery, not from machine guns. From single rifle shots fired by Soviet snipers the Germans couldn't see, couldn't find, couldn't stop. This is the story of the deadliest individual soldiers in World War II. Soviet snipers who turned the Eastern Front into a hunting ground where German officers were the prey. This is the story of how the Wehrmacht went from mocking Russian rifles as crude relics to living in absolute terror of marksmen who could kill from half a mile away. This is the story of over 10,000 German soldiers, 400 of them officers, killed by fewer than 2,000 Soviet snipers, and how those deaths created psychological damage far beyond the numbers. Because being killed by artillery is impersonal. Being hunted by an invisible shooter who knows your name, your rank, and your daily routine, that's something else entirely. That's terror. To understand this story, we need to understand both sides. The German perspective first. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, Wehrmacht officers genuinely believed they were fighting an inferior enemy. Not just militarily inferior, racially inferior. Nazi ideology taught that Slavs were Untermenschen, subhumans, primitive, disorganized. The Soviet military was seen as a peasant horde with obsolete equipment and no tactical sophistication. And German officers looked at Soviet weapons and saw confirmation of that belief. Soviet rifles were primarily the Mosin-Nagant, a bolt-action rifle designed in 1891. 1891, that's 50 years old by the time of Operation Barbarossa. It was a 5-round internal magazine, heavy, 7.62mm, long barrel. Crude sights. It looked like something from World War I because it basically was. German officers carried modern weapons. Walter pistols, some had semi-automatic rifles, they had binoculars, maps, radios. They represented modern military professionalism. Soviet conscripts had rifles from the age of their grandfathers. So German officers joked about it, made fun of Russian equipment, called Soviet soldiers primitive, said the war would be over in 3 months because how could peasants with antique rifles defeat the modern Wehrmacht? That contempt extended to Soviet tactics. Soviet soldiers in the early war often attacked in human waves, poorly coordinated, high casualties. It seemed to confirm everything Germans believed. These weren't soldiers. They were barely armed civilians being thrown at German machine guns. But the Germans missed something. They were so focused on mocking Soviet equipment and tactics that they didn't notice what a few Soviet soldiers were doing with those supposedly primitive rifles. They didn't notice that crude can mean simple, that simple can mean reliable, that an old bolt-action rifle in the hands of an expert marksman is deadlier than a modern weapon in the hands of an amateur. And they definitely didn't notice that the Soviet Union was systematically training snipers on a scale no other military had ever attempted. Let me tell you about Soviet sniper culture. It didn't start in World War II. It started in the 1920s and 30s. The Soviet Union had a tradition of marksmanship dating back to Russian hunters and frontier marksmen. After the revolution, the Soviet military recognized sniping as a valuable skill. They established sniper schools, trained thousands of shooters, created a culture where marksmanship was celebrated. Soviet youth organizations taught rifle skills. Shooting competitions were national events. By 1941, the Soviet Union had a massive pool of trained marksmen to draw from. When the war started, the Soviet military quickly recognized that snipers were force multipliers. One trained sniper could kill dozens of enemies, could disrupt enemy operations, could create fear. So they expanded sniper training dramatically, took soldiers who showed aptitude with rifles and put them through intensive courses, taught them fieldcraft, camouflage, patience, ballistics, target selection, and most importantly, they taught them to hunt officers. Here's where the Soviet sniper program became truly deadly. Soviet snipers were specifically trained to target German officers, not random soldiers, officers. The logic was simple. Kill a lieutenant and a platoon loses coordination. Kill a captain and a company becomes less effective. Kill a major and a battalion's operations suffer. Target the leadership structure and the entire enemy formation degrades. This wasn't just killing for kill counts. This was psychological and organizational warfare. And Soviet snipers had advantages that made them perfect for this mission. First, they were often from rural backgrounds, peasants, hunters, people who'd grown up tracking animals through forests. They understood camouflage, understood patience, could sit motionless for hours, could read terrain. German officers, often from urban or aristocratic backgrounds, didn't have those skills. They stood out, moved predictably, made themselves targets. Second, Soviet snipers used optics. The Mosin-Nagant, that supposedly primitive rifle, could be fitted with a scope. The PU scope, 3.5 times magnification, simple but effective. A skilled shooter with a Mosin-Nagant and a PU scope could reliably hit targets at 400 yards, could make headshots at 300 yards, could kill at ranges where the target couldn't even see the shooter. Third, Soviet snipers worked in pairs, a shooter and a spotter. The spotter had binoculars, would locate targets, calculate range and wind. The shooter would focus on the shot. This system was more effective than solo snipers, more reliable, harder to counter. If one was killed, the other could continue the mission or withdraw and report intelligence. And fourth, Soviet snipers were patient. Germans were used to aggressive warfare, fast movement, quick decisions. Soviet snipers would wait for hours, sometimes days, for the perfect shot. They'd study German routines, learn when officers moved between positions, when they were most exposed. Then they'd take one shot, kill the target, and disappear before German forces could respond. Let me tell you about the most famous Soviet sniper, Vasily Zaitsev. He's become legendary partly because of propaganda, partly because of the movie Enemy at the Gates, but mostly because his story is documented and verified. Zaitsev was born in the Ural Mountains, learned to shoot hunting deer with his grandfather, joined the Soviet Navy, then transferred to the army when war broke out, was sent to Stalingrad in September 1942. Stalingrad was perfect sniper terrain. Urban warfare, rubble, destroyed buildings, sight lines measured in yards, not miles. Close-range chaos where a skilled rifleman could be devastating. Zaitsev quickly distinguished himself. Between September and December 1942, he's credited with 225 confirmed kills, 225, in 4 months. That's almost 2 kills per day. And most of those weren't random soldiers. They were officers, specialists, high-value targets. Zaitsev became a Soviet propaganda hero. His exploits were publicized to boost morale. But more importantly to Germans, he became a nightmare. German officers in Stalingrad knew Zaitsev's name, knew he was hunting them, knew that moving carelessly during daylight could mean death. The psychological impact was enormous. German officers started changing their behavior, stopped using binoculars because the lens reflection could give away their position and identify them as officers, stopped wearing officer insignia prominently, started moving only at night or using covered routes. But Zaitsev was just one of thousands. The Soviet military trained an estimated 2,000 snipers during the war. 2,000. Not all survived. Not all were as successful as Zaitsev. But collectively, they killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers. 10,000. And about 400 of those were officers. 400 German officers killed by Soviet snipers, majors, captains, lieutenants. The leadership structure of entire divisions eroded by invisible marksmen. Now, let's talk about what this felt like from the German perspective. Imagine you're a Wehrmacht officer. You've been trained in military academies. You've studied tactics. You're educated, professional. You command a company of 150 men. You're responsible for their lives and their mission. You're in Stalingrad or some other Eastern Front hellscape. And every day, officers are dying. Not in combat, not in firefights, just suddenly, walking between positions, looking at maps, giving orders. They just drop dead, headshot, from a shooter nobody saw, nobody heard, nobody can find. You start to realize that someone is watching you, always, that every time you stand up, every time you look over a parapet, every time you cross an open space, you might die. There's no warning, no incoming artillery whistle, no machine gun burst, just the crack of a rifle and you're dead. Or the man next to you is dead, and you never see the shooter, never know where they are, never know if they're watching you right now. That's psychological warfare at its purest. It's not about the body count. 400 officers over 3 years of Eastern Front warfare isn't strategically significant, but the fear it creates is immeasurable. German officers started suffering from what would now be called PTSD, paranoia, stress breakdowns. Some refused to leave cover during daylight. Some had to be relieved of command because they couldn't function under the constant threat of invisible death. A German lieutenant named Friedrich Weber wrote in his diary in November 1942, "I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I imagine a Soviet sniper watching me through a scope, waiting for me to make a mistake. I've stopped wearing my officer insignia. I dress like a common soldier. I move only in darkness. But I know they're out there, patient, waiting. 2 officers in my battalion were killed this week. Headshots. Both experienced men. Both careful. It doesn't matter. The snipers find you eventually. This is not warfare. This is hunting. And we are the prey." That diary entry captures the psychological reality. German officers felt hunted, not fighting an enemy, being hunted by one. And there's something uniquely terrifying about being hunted, about knowing that someone, somewhere, has decided you're going to die, has studied you, knows your routines, is waiting for the perfect moment. It's personal in a way that artillery or machine gun fire isn't. An artillery shell doesn't care who you are. A sniper has chosen you specifically. Now let's talk about Soviet sniper tactics in detail, because understanding how they operated explains why they were so effective and so terrifying. Soviet snipers didn't just find a good position and start shooting. They were methodical, strategic, intelligent. First, target selection. Soviet snipers prioritized officers, then specialists, radio operators, medics, machine gunners, people whose death would have maximum impact on German operations. How did they identify officers? Insignia, obviously, but by 1942, many German officers had stopped wearing obvious rank insignia precisely to avoid snipers. So Soviet snipers looked for behavioral clues. Who gives orders? Who uses binoculars? Who carries maps? Who other soldiers defer to? Soviet spotters would watch German positions for hours, cataloguing who was who. Then the sniper would kill the highest value target available. Second, positioning. Soviet snipers used unconventional positions, not just obvious spots like church steeples or tall buildings. Those were death traps. Germans would shell obvious sniper positions. Soviet snipers hid in rubble piles, in basements with small firing ports, in sewers, in burned-out vehicles. They'd create hides that looked like debris. They'd camouflage so thoroughly that German soldiers could walk within yards and not see them. They'd stay in position for days if necessary, not moving, barely breathing, waiting. Third, shot discipline. Soviet snipers were trained not to take marginal shots. If the target was in cover, you wait. If the range was too far, you wait. If the wind was wrong, you wait. You take one shot when conditions are perfect and the target is exposed. Then you relocate immediately, whether you hit or miss, because German forces would triangulate the shot origin and respond with artillery or infantry assault. One shot, one kill, relocate. That was the doctrine. Fourth, psychological operations. Soviet snipers sometimes engaged in deliberate terror tactics. They'd wound a German soldier, not kill him. The wounded man would scream. German medics would come to help. The sniper would kill the medics, then kill anyone else who tried to help. This created a dilemma. Do you help your wounded comrades and risk death, or do you leave them to die? Either choice damages morale. Soviet snipers understood psychological warfare intuitively. Let me tell you about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, female Soviet sniper, one of about 2,000 women who served as snipers in the Red Army. Pavlichenko is credited with 309 confirmed kills. 309, including 36 enemy snipers. 36. She hunted German and Romanian snipers. Counter-sniper work. The most dangerous form of sniping because you're fighting someone with equal skills and equipment. Pavlichenko fought at Odessa and Sevastopol in 1941 and 1942. She was wounded in June 1942 and evacuated. Later toured the United States doing propaganda work, became the first Soviet citizen received by a US president at the White House. But before that, she was a killer, a highly effective one. German forces knew about her, reportedly tried to recruit her with propaganda broadcasts, tried to bribe her. When that didn't work, they tried to kill her. German snipers specifically hunted her. She killed 36 of them. Think about what that means. 36 German snipers, trained professionals, tried to kill Pavlichenko. She killed all of them. Sniper versus sniper. Pure skill, no advantages. Equal equipment. Whoever made the first mistake died. And she never made the first mistake. 36 times German snipers made the first mistake. That's not luck. That's exceptional skill and nerve. Now let's talk about how Germans tried to counter Soviet snipers. Because they did try. They weren't passive victims. German forces developed counter-sniper tactics. First, they started training their own snipers. Germany had sniper programs, but expanded them in response to Soviet success. German snipers were equipped with excellent rifles, the Karabiner 98K with scopes, semi-automatic Gewehr 43s later in the war, good optics, professional training. German snipers were skilled, but they were outnumbered. The Soviet Union trained thousands of snipers. Germany trained hundreds. The Soviet Union prioritized sniping as a doctrine. Germany treated it as a specialty. That numerical disparity meant Soviet snipers dominated. For every German sniper, there were 3 or 4 Soviet snipers. The mathematics were brutal. Second, Germans used artillery saturation. If you couldn't find the sniper, you destroyed everything in the area they might be hiding. This worked sometimes, but was resource-intensive. You'd use hundreds of artillery shells to maybe kill 1 sniper. And Soviet snipers learned to relocate before artillery arrived. Third, Germans changed their operational behavior. Officers stopped behaving like officers during daylight. They dressed like enlisted men. Moved in groups where their rank wasn't obvious. Used covered routes. Only used binoculars from cover. These precautions reduced casualties, but also reduced effectiveness. An officer who's afraid to expose himself can't lead effectively. Fourth, Germans tried psychological warfare. Propaganda broadcasts warning Soviet snipers they'd be executed if captured. Offers of rewards for information about sniper positions. Threats against civilians in areas where snipers operated. None of it worked. Soviet snipers were motivated by patriotism, revenge, and professional pride. German threats were meaningless. The most famous German counter-sniper story involves Major Erwin König. Allegedly, he was a German sniper sent specifically to kill Wassily Zaitsev. The two supposedly stalked each other through Stalingrad for days in a duel of wits and skill. Eventually, Zaitsev killed König. That story was made famous by the movie Enemy at the Gates. The problem is, it's probably fictional. There's no German record of a Major Erwin König, no verification he existed. The story appears to be Soviet propaganda or post-war embellishment. But the fact that the story exists, that it became famous, tells us something important. Both sides understood that sniper warfare was personal. It was about individual skill, about duels between expert marksmen, about psychology as much as marksmanship. Whether König existed or not, the idea of him resonated because it captured the reality of the sniper war. Soviet and German snipers did hunt each other, did engage in elaborate games of hide-and-seek where the loser died. Now, let's talk about specific engagements that illustrate Soviet sniper effectiveness. Battle of Stalingrad, obviously. Between August 1942 and February 1943, Soviet snipers killed an estimated 3,000 German soldiers in Stalingrad. 3,000. In one city, over 6 months. That's 17 kills per day on average. And remember, this wasn't indiscriminate shooting. These were targeted kills, officers, specialists, high-value targets. German units in Stalingrad developed routines specifically to avoid snipers. Movement only at night. Communication by runner instead of radio to avoid antenna-carrying radio operators being targeted. Officers commanding from covered positions, using periscopes instead of looking over cover. These adaptations reduced casualties, but also reduced operational effectiveness. Units that are afraid to move during daylight are less capable than units that can maneuver freely. Another engagement, the Siege of Leningrad. September 1941 to January 1944. 2.5 years. Soviet snipers defending Leningrad killed an estimated 2,000 German soldiers during the siege. 2,000. German officers besieging Leningrad learned quickly that showing yourself in sniper range was death. Soviet snipers had excellent fields of fire from the city, could engage German positions at ranges up to 600 yards. German forces had to build extensive trench systems and covered approaches just to avoid sniper fire. One Soviet sniper, Feodosy Smolyakov, defending Leningrad, is credited with over 400 kills, 400 during the siege. Whether that number is accurate is debatable. Soviet kill counts were sometimes inflated for propaganda, but even if you cut it in half, 200 kills by one sniper in one siege is extraordinary. Let me tell you about the Battle of Kursk, July 1943. Germany's last major offensive on the Eastern Front, massive tank battle. Over 2 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks. Soviet snipers operated during Kursk just like they did everywhere else. They targeted German tank commanders. Tank commanders often expose themselves from turret hatches to see battlefield. Soviet snipers killed them. A tank without a commander is less effective, might not see threats, might not coordinate with other tanks, might make tactical errors. Killing tank commanders disrupted German armor operations. Soviet sniper reports from Kursk document dozens of German tank commanders killed. Dozens. And each death meant a tank operating at reduced effectiveness. It's hard to quantify the tactical impact of killing tank commanders, but German after-action reports from Kursk mention tank units suffering from leadership losses. Units where multiple tank commanders were killed and replacements were inexperienced. Units that performed worse than expected, partly because Soviet snipers had decapitated their leadership. Now let's talk about the class warfare element of Soviet sniping. Because there's a dimension to this story that's important. Many Soviet snipers were peasants, working class, rural, the people Nazi ideology designated as Untermenschen, and they were killing German officers, often from aristocratic families, educated, privileged. The Wehrmacht officer corps in 1941 still had many officers from traditional military families. Prussian Junkers, minor nobility, men who'd been raised to believe in their inherent superiority, and those men were being killed by Russian peasants, by people they'd been taught were racially inferior. The irony was devastating, not just to the individuals being killed, but to German morale generally. The idea that some uneducated Soviet farmer with an antique rifle could kill a German officer with centuries of military tradition in his family was psychologically disorienting. It challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial hierarchy. Soviet propaganda exploited this brilliantly. They publicized sniper successes specifically to humiliate Germans. Stories about peasant snipers killing German officers were broadcast, printed in newspapers, used to boost Soviet morale and demoralize Germans. And it worked. German soldiers wrote home about their fear of Soviet snipers, about how the supposedly inferior Slavs were killing officers with impunity. Those letters undermined the Nazi racial narrative, made soldiers question what they'd been told about enemy inferiority. Vasily Zaitsev's background was emphasized in Soviet propaganda for this reason. He was the son of peasants. From the Urals, no military family, no privileged education, just a hunter who learned to shoot, and he was killing German officers who had university educations and aristocratic lineages. The propaganda value was immense. It demonstrated that Soviet common people could defeat German elites, that courage and skill mattered more than background or breeding. Let me tell you about the last year of the war, 1944 to 1945, when Soviet forces were advancing west into Poland, Hungary, Germany itself. Soviet snipers continued operating. German officer casualties to snipers remained high, but by then, The nature of the sniper war had changed. Germany was losing. Everyone knew it. Soviet snipers weren't just killing for tactical advantage. They were executing judgment. Revenge for the millions of Soviet citizens Germany had killed. The millions who died in German POW camps, the Holocaust, the deliberate starvation policies. Soviet snipers saw themselves as instruments of justice. German officers captured after the war sometimes talked about this, about how Soviet snipers in the last year seemed to be hunting with particular intensity, not just shooting targets of opportunity, but actively stalking German officers, waiting for them specifically. One German captain, interviewed in the 1950s, said, "You could feel it, the hatred. Soviet snipers in 45 weren't just soldiers anymore. They were executioners, and we were the condemned. Every German officer on the Eastern Front felt it. You were marked for death, not might be killed, would be killed if the snipers could reach you. It was personal." That's probably true. By 1945, many Soviet snipers had been fighting for 3 or 4 years, had seen their country ravaged, had lost family members, had witnessed German atrocities. Their shooting wasn't impersonal anymore. It was revenge. And that made them even more dangerous because revenge is a powerful motivator. Now let's talk about the final statistics and what they mean. Over the course of the Eastern Front War, Soviet snipers killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers, 400 of them officers. Those numbers are from German casualty records, cross-referenced with Soviet claims. They're probably somewhat inflated, but broadly accurate. 10,000 Germans killed by snipers out of over 4 million German casualties on the Eastern Front. That's 0.25%, a quarter of 1%. So, on one level, Soviet snipers weren't strategically significant. They didn't change the outcome of the war. Germany lost the Eastern Front because of Soviet numerical superiority, Allied material support, strategic overextension, and Hitler's disastrous decision-making. Not because of snipers, but to focus only on numbers misses the psychological impact. 10,000 individual, personal, targeted killings, 400 officers specifically hunted and executed. The psychological effect on surviving German officers was enormous. The fear, the paranoia, the changed behavior, the degraded leadership effectiveness. And more broadly, Soviet snipers challenged German assumptions about racial superiority and military professionalism. The idea that the supposedly inferior Soviets could develop specialized soldiers who were better than Germans at a specific military skill was deeply troubling to Nazi ideology. It suggested that maybe the Untermenschen weren't so inferior after all, that maybe German military superiority was propaganda rather than reality. After the war, Soviet snipers were celebrated as heroes, given medals. Some, like Zaitsev and Pavlichenko, became famous. Sniper schools were named after them. They represented Soviet resistance, Soviet skill, Soviet determination. They'd taken the war to the invaders on personal terms, one shot at a time, one dead German officer at a time. They'd proven that individual courage and skill could make a difference even in a war of millions. German veterans rarely talked about Soviet snipers after the war. It was a humiliating topic, admitting that you'd been terrified of invisible shooters, that officers in your unit had been picked off one by one while you couldn't do anything about it. That wasn't something German military professionals wanted to discuss. But in private memoirs, in letters, the fear comes through. The respect for Soviet sniper skills. The acknowledgement that those supposedly primitive Russians with antique rifles had been absolutely lethal. Otto Karius, the tank ace I mentioned in a previous script, wrote about Soviet snipers in his memoir. He said, The Soviet sniper program was the most effective specialized training program of any military in the war. They created thousands of expert marksmen who operated with skill and courage. German snipers were individually excellent but outnumbered. Soviet snipers dominated no man's land, made daylight movements suicidal, changed how we fought. I respected Soviet snipers more than almost any other enemy forces we encountered, because you couldn't see them coming, couldn't hear them until it was too late, couldn't fight back effectively. They were ghosts, lethal ghosts. That's high praise from a German officer, and it's accurate. Soviet snipers were exceptional. They took an old rifle, the Mosin-Nagant, that Germans had mocked as obsolete, and used it to kill thousands. They proved that marksmanship, fieldcraft and intelligence matter more than equipment modernity. They turned the Eastern Front into a hunting ground where German officers were prey. Let me end with one final story. April 1945. Berlin is falling. Soviet forces are in the city. A German lieutenant colonel named Hans Richter is trying to organize a defense at a street barricade. He's exhausted. The war is lost. But he's still trying to do his duty. He stands up to signal his men. A rifle shot echoes through the rubble. Richter drops dead. Headshot. From 500 yards. A Soviet sniper in the ruins, hunting until the very end. Richter was probably one of the last German officers killed by a Soviet sniper. The war ended a few weeks later, but that shot, that final kill, represents everything about the Soviet sniper war. Relentless, professional, personal. Germans had joked about Russian rifles at the beginning of the war, called them primitive, obsolete, ineffective. They stopped joking when officers started dying, when the body count reached 400, when they realized that the supposedly inferior Soviets had created a sniper program that was the most effective in the world. Wehrmacht officers joked about Russian rifles until Soviet snipers killed 400 of them. And then they stopped joking, started fearing, started dying. One shot at a time. From rifles they dismissed as antiques, fired by shooters they dismissed as subhuman. The joke was on them, and the punchline was lethal. 10,000 dead, 400 officers, 2,000 Soviet snipers. One conclusion. Contempt for your enemy is the deadliest mistake you can make. The Germans learned that lesson the hard way, one headshot at a time.